In the summer of 1983, Bette Davis had a mastectomy. 9 days later, she suffered a series of strokes that left one side of her face and her left arm partially paralyzed and took away much of her speech. While recovering, she fell and broke her hip. She was 75 years old, she weighed under 80 pounds, and she spent the next months relearning how to talk. In May 1985, her only biological child published a book about her. It was called My Mother's Keeper. It ran to 256 pages. It accused Davis of being a bullying, manipulative alcoholic, and it was released on Mother's Day. The book was a bestseller. Her mother lived another 4 years and never spoke to her again. That is where every version of this story starts, and it is where most of them stop, because the timing is so brutal that it settles the question for most people before they have thought about it. A daughter waited until her mother was helpless and then knifed her in public, and Hollywood closed ranks. And that is the end of it. It isn't the end of it, and the reason it isn't is that B.D. Hyman had finished writing that book long before the stroke happened. The publication schedule was a coincidence of the industry, not a plan. She did not choose her mother's illness as a moment. She chose to publish while her mother was alive, which is a different decision and a far more interesting one. And it is the decision that this entire story turns on. Because 7 years earlier, Christina Crawford had published Mommy Dearest about Joan Crawford, Bette Davis's most famous professional rival, and that book had waited until its subject was dead. Christina Crawford published in 1978, a year after Joan Crawford died, and the woman she was describing had no ability to answer. Bette Davis could answer, and she did. So the question is not whether B.D. Hyman was lying, which is where the argument has been stuck for 40 years, and where it produces nothing. The question is why a daughter with a genuine and probably substantially true set of grievances against a difficult mother chose to present them in a form that guaranteed nobody would believe her. And the answer to that tells you more about both women than the book does. Start with who Bette Davis was, because the mother in that book and the woman in the record are not obviously the same person. Ruth Elizabeth Davis was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, in April 1908. Her father, Harlow Morrell Davis, a Harvard-educated patent attorney, walked out on the family when she was 7 and her sister Barbara was 5. He did not come back, he provided minimally, and Bette Davis's account of him for the rest of her life was cold in a way that never softened. Her mother, Ruthie, then held the three of them together by working as a portrait photographer, retouching negatives at night, moving them repeatedly between rented rooms in New England, and eventually pushing her elder daughter toward the stage with a determination that everyone who met her described as formidable. There is a detail from that childhood that Davis repeated for the rest of her life, and that everybody assumed was invention. She would tell interviewers she was born near Salem, that she was descended from Mary Bradbury, one of the women convicted in the witch trials of 1692, and that a bolt of lightning struck a tree outside the house at the moment of her birth. It was taken as Hollywood hokum, a star burnishing her own mythology, and nobody thought about it twice for 60 years. Keep it in mind. It comes back in 2017 out of her daughter's mouth, and it is not a joke by then. Hold that structure, because it repeats. A father who leaves, a mother who is the entire architecture of the household and who is enormously, sometimes suffocatingly, present. Bette Davis grew up inside exactly the arrangement she would later be accused of imposing on her own daughter, and she was extremely close to Ruthie for the whole of Ruthie's life. The career is not really the subject here, but it establishes what kind of person we are dealing with. She went to Hollywood in 1930. Universal dropped her. Warner Brothers picked her up in 1932, and by 1935, she had an Academy Award for Dangerous, and by 1938, a second for Jezebel. She was nominated 10 times. In 1936, she did something almost nobody in the studio system did. She walked out on her Warner Brothers contract, went to England and got sued for it, and she lost the case and paid the costs, and then came back and got better parts anyway, because the fight had established what she was willing to do. She helped found the Hollywood Canteen in 1942. In 1941, she became the first woman president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and resigned within weeks when it became clear the position was ceremonial and she was expected to sit still. And there is a specific thing about the work that matters for what follows. Bette Davis built her entire career on being willing to be unlikable on screen, at a time when actresses were not permitted to be. She played murderers, manipulators, drunks, and monsters. She let herself be photographed badly. In Of Human Bondage, she played a character so repellent that Warner Brothers did not want to lend her for it, and it made her. In Baby Jane, at 54, she appeared in white pancake makeup as a grotesque, and it revived her. So she was a woman who had spent 50 years demonstrating professionally that she did not care about being liked, and who then, in 1985, discovered that she cared enormously about being liked by exactly one person and could not get it. That is the person. Combative, professionally fearless, absolutely uninterested in being liked, and by universal agreement, including from people who admired her. Extremely difficult to be in a room with when she had decided something. The marriages need laying out because B.D. grew up inside the wreckage of them, and because the pattern is relevant. Harmon Nelson, a bandleader she had known since school, married 1932 and divorced 1938. And he named her career and the disparity in their earnings as the problem, which was the standard complaint of every man married to a successful actress in that era, and was probably true. Arthur Farnsworth married 1940, who collapsed on a Hollywood pavement in 1943 and died of a skull fracture, in circumstances that produced an inquest and a certain amount of ugly speculation and no charges. William Grant Sherry, the painter, married 1945, divorced 1950, B.D.'s father, and Davis alleged violence in that marriage. Gary Merrill, married 1950, divorced 1960, 4 marriages. One ended by a sudden death and an inquest, at least one involving allegations of violence, all of them over by the time she was 52. That is the domestic environment. Whatever else is argued about, it was not a stable house. She had her first child at 39, deliberately. Her own explanation, given to the New York Times in 1981, her career was made by then. She was only making 1 or 2 pictures a year, and those were years to be with her children and enjoy them. Barbara Davis Sherry, called B.D., was born on the 1st of May, 1947, in Santa Ana, California. Her father was William Grant Sherry, a painter and Davis's 3rd husband, and that marriage ended in 1950. B.D. appeared as an infant in her mother's film Payment on Demand in 1951, which is a detail worth noting only because it means she was on a soundstage before she could walk, and there was never a version of her life that was not attached to the career. In 1950, Davis married Gary Merrill, her co-star in All About Eve. They adopted 2 children, Margot in 1951 and Michael in 1952. And that marriage, which lasted 10 years, is the part of this story that everybody skips and that changes everything you think about the rest of it. Because the thing about My Mother's Keeper that almost nobody who talks about it has registered is what it does not say. B.D. Hyman does not accuse Bette Davis of physical abuse, not once. The comparison to Mommy Dearest is made constantly, and it is wrong on the central point, because Christina Crawford's book is a physical abuse narrative, and B.D. Hyman's is not. What B.D. Hyman says instead is that her mother was an alcoholic, that she was a bully, that she was emotionally manipulative, that she staged suicide attempts for sympathy, and, crucially, that Bette Davis was a battered wife, and that the violent alcoholic in that house was Gary Merrill. Sit with that for a second, because it is genuinely strange. The most notorious hatchet job in the history of celebrity memoir contains, at its center, a claim that its subject was the victim of domestic violence. That is not the book people think it is. And it means the argument about whether B.D. was telling the truth has been conducted for 40 years by people characterizing a book most of them have not read. Now Margot, and this is the hardest part of the whole account. Margot Merrill was adopted in 1951. Within a few years, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. She was diagnosed with brain damage, and the accounts of the period suggest either birth injury or an incident in infancy, and it was never precisely resolved. She had severe learning disability and episodes of violent behavior that the household could not manage. At around 3 years old, she was placed at the Laughlin School in Geneva, New York, a residential facility, and she remained in institutional care for the rest of her life. Davis paid for it, visited, and spoke about her rarely and with what witnesses described as real pain. Now, by the standards of 1955, that is what families did, and it was what doctors advised, and to judge it by 2026 standards is anachronistic in the way I keep warning about in these stories. But it is also the single place in Bette Davis's parenting where the hardest questions genuinely live. And here is what should stop you. My Mother's Keeper barely engages with it. The book that set out to prove Bette Davis was a monstrous mother spends its energy on drinking, tantrums, telephone calls, and dinner parties, and does comparatively little with the daughter who was sent away at 3 and never came home. That tells you something about what the book was actually for. And there is a second thing about Margot that has to be said, because it explains a good deal about the house B.D. grew up in. Margot's placement happened when B.D. was around 7 or 8, old enough to remember a sister arriving and then a sister leaving, and old enough to absorb whatever the household's explanation was, which in 1955 would have been almost nothing. That is the environment. A child watching an adopted sibling be removed, and understanding that some things in that family were dealt with by being made to disappear and never discussed again. Whatever else is true about Bette Davis as a mother, the household had a documented method for handling a problem it could not solve, and B.D. had watched it operate before she was 10. Michael Merrill, the other adopted child, grew up, went to law school, became a practicing attorney in Boston, married, had children, and stayed close to his mother for the whole of her life. He is the control group in this experiment. Same house, same mother, same drinking, if there was drinking, same decade. He never wrote a word against her, and when the book came out, he severed contact with his sister and by every account never spoke to B.D. Hyman again. Now the marriage, because it is impossible to talk about B.D. Hyman's account of her mother's judgment without it. In 1963, at the age of 16, B.D. married Jeremy Hyman, a man of 29 who worked for 7 Arts Productions. Her mother consented to it and supported it publicly. They stayed married for more than 50 years, until his death in 2017, and had 2 sons, Ashley and Justin. So it was not a disaster, and it is not being raised here as one. It is being raised because of what it says about the household. Whatever else is in dispute, this is not. Bette Davis signed the papers permitting her 16-year-old to marry a man in his late 20s and defended the decision in public. You can construct that as a mother who trusted her daughter's judgment in an era with different norms. You can also construct it as the single most consequential piece of evidence B.D. Hyman had, and she did not need a book to establish it, because it was in the newspapers in 1963. And there's one more thing from that period. In 1962, B.D., billed as B.D. Merrill, appeared in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, playing the teenage neighbor. She was 15. Her mother was 54, playing a grotesque, and made the film in a state of open warfare with Joan Crawford that has since been dramatized in a television series. So the daughter's first substantial professional experience was standing on a set, watching her mother conduct the most famous feud in Hollywood history. Subscribe if you want more of these, because the next part is where the whole thing turns. By the early 1980s, 2 things had happened to B.D. Hyman. She had become a born-again Christian, and she and her husband had money problems, significant enough that reports at the time and since described the family's move to the Bahamas as connected to debts run up in the United States. Her mother had been supporting them financially for years, which Davis herself put on the record. And in 1985, the book came out, and B.D. gave her explanation for it to People magazine. And the explanation is remarkable and worth quoting properly. "I wrote the book because I love her, and I want to reach her," she said. "I could have written the manuscript and sent it to Mother and not published it. She wouldn't have read it. She won't listen to anything she doesn't want to hear. She hangs up the phone or walks out the door. So I went the only route I felt would reach her, the public forum. What is seen by the world is the most important thing to Mother. This is essentially a public letter to my mother." Read that carefully, because it is either the most sincere thing in this story or the most self-deceiving, and I honestly do not know which. What she is describing is a form of intervention. Her position is that her mother could not be reached privately, that Bette Davis cared more about public opinion than about any individual relationship, and that the only lever available was public humiliation, and that she pulled it out of love to force a confrontation that would end in her mother accepting Christ. That is coherent. It is also, when you say it out loud, an argument that publicly destroying somebody is a legitimate means of saving them, and the number of people prepared to accept that in 1985 turned out to be approximately zero. And then Mike Wallace did the thing that ended it. Wallace had interviewed B.D. Hyman for 60 Minutes some years earlier, before any of this, and in that interview she had praised her mother's abilities as a parent and said that she had adopted many of Bette Davis's principles in raising her own children. When the book came out, Wallace rebroadcast it. That is the moment the argument stopped being an argument, not a denial from Davis, not a statement from a publicist, not a friend calling her a liar. Her own face, on tape, in her own words, saying the opposite, played back on national television. There is a defense available to her, that she was protecting her mother in public at the time, which is exactly what daughters of famous people do, and that the tape shows the loyalty rather than the truth. That defense is not unreasonable. It also requires the audience to conclude that B.D. Hyman lies on television when it suits her, which is not a helpful thing to establish about your only witness. Because that is the structural problem with my mother's keeper, and it is the reason it failed as an indictment. B.D. Hyman was the only witness. Consider who else was in a position to know and what they said. Gary Merrill, Davis's ex-husband, the man B.D.'s own book identifies as the violent one, a person with every conceivable reason to enjoy watching Bette Davis get destroyed. Described his stepdaughter's motivation in 2 words, cruelty and greed. Michael Merrill, raised in the same house by the same woman, cut her off permanently. Catherine Cermak, Davis's personal assistant from 1979 until her death, who was living and working with her through the exact period the book describes, has spent 40 years saying it was false. Mia Farrow, who worked with Davis on Death on the Nile in 1978 and had known B.D. since childhood, called the book trashy, said she lost all respect for her, and said flatly that she had loved Davis. And several of Davis's friends stated publicly that specific episodes in the book were factually inaccurate, while others with first-hand knowledge disagreed just as strongly, which is worth saying because the consensus was not total, and pretending it was would be its own kind of dishonesty. But the weight is overwhelming and it points one way, and here is why that matters more than it might seem. Christina Crawford's book has been substantially reevaluated over the decades. Serious people now regard much of Mommy Dearest as credible because other members of that household and outside witnesses corroborated elements of it, and because a pattern emerged. Nobody corroborated B.D. Hyman, not one person who was there, and that absence has an alternative explanation which has to be stated because it is the strongest argument available to her side and it is not a stupid one. Everybody who publicly contradicted B.D. Hyman had an interest in doing so. Catherine Cermak inherited a substantial share of the estate. Michael Merrill inherited the rest. Mia Farrow was a friend and colleague of the accused. Gary Merrill was a man B.D.'s own book had named as the household's violent alcoholic, and calling his accuser greedy is what such a man would do whether or not she was. So the roster of witnesses against her is also, almost exactly, the roster of people who benefited from her mother's version being believed. That does not make her right. It does mean the case against her is weaker than the volume of it suggests, and anybody who tells you the matter is settled has not looked at who was doing the settling. It is worth understanding what the book industry looked like in 1985, because B.D. Hyman did not invent anything, and the market she walked into had been built for her. Mommy Dearest, sold in enormous numbers in 1978, was adapted into a film in 1981 that became a permanent cultural reference and established a genre with a fixed shape: the Golden Age star, the adoring public, the private monster, the child who finally speaks. Publishers went looking for the next one. Agents pitched it. There was, by 1983, a demonstrated commercial appetite for exactly this book about exactly this kind of woman. And Bette Davis was the obvious candidate, because she and Joan Crawford had spent decades as a matched pair in the public imagination. The rivalry, Baby Jane, the mutual insults that got quoted at parties. If Crawford's daughter had one, Davis's daughter having one was almost a structural inevitability. The symmetry was too good. Which is a point in B.D. Hyman's favor that nobody makes for her. She did not have to invent the idea that her mother was difficult. She had to decide whether to sell it, and a publisher was standing there with a check at the exact moment her family's finances were in trouble. Now Davis's answer, which is the reason this story has an ending at all. In 1987, 2 years before she died, Bette Davis published This and That, a short book, 160-odd pages, about the strokes, the recovery, the career, Ronald Reagan, and Baby Jane. And she closed it with an open letter to her daughter, because B.D. had closed her book with a letter to her mother, and Davis was not going to be outstaged in her own memoir. The letter is a strange document, and the strangeness is the most revealing thing in this entire account. She opens by matching the form. You ended your book with a letter to me. I have decided to do the same. She goes for the writing rather than the woman. There is no doubt you have a great potential as a writer of fiction. You have always been a great storyteller. I have often, lo these many years, said to you, B.D., that is not the way it was. You are imagining things. She addresses the title directly, and this is the sharpest thing she ever wrote. If it refers to money, if my memory serves me right, I've been your keeper all these many years. I am continuing to do so, as my name has made your book about me a success. And the summary judgment. The sum total of your having written this book is a glaring lack of loyalty and thanks for the very privileged life I feel you have been given. Now look at what she does not do. She does not deny the drinking. She does not address the alcoholism allegation at all. She does not respond to the account of her marriage to Gary Merrill, or to the claim that she staged suicide attempts, or to a single specific incident of the emotional cruelty the book describes. What she disputes at length, and readers noticed this at the time and have noticed it ever since, is a claim about Gone with the Wind. B.D. had written that her mother was a pathetic creature because she had not played Scarlett O'Hara, and Davis spends a substantial portion of a letter to her estranged child, correcting the record on a 1939 casting decision, explaining that Selznick had approached Warner about borrowing her and Errol Flynn, and that she had refused because she did not think Flynn was right for Rhett Butler. Her daughter accused her of being an alcoholic who tormented her family, and Bette Davis went to the mat over a part she turned down 48 years earlier. That is the whole marriage of the mother and the career in one paragraph, and it is the closest thing to corroboration of B.D. Hyman's central thesis that exists anywhere. Not the drinking, not the tantrums. This, that the public record of Bette Davis mattered to her in a way that the private accusation did not, and that offered a choice between defending her conduct as a mother and defending her conduct as an actress. She chose the second without appearing to notice she had made a choice, and then she disinherited her. The will left the estate to Michael Merrill, the adopted son who had become a lawyer, and to Catherine Cermak, the assistant. B.D. Hyman received nothing, and neither did B.D.'s two sons, Davis's grandchildren, who had done nothing at all. That last clause is worth stopping on, because it is where the account of a wronged mother becomes complicated. Cutting off the daughter who wrote the book is a defensible response to a genuine betrayal. Cutting off Ashley and Justin, who were children when the book was published and had no involvement in it, is something else. And it is exactly the kind of thing the book accuses her of. Cermak's account of what the book did is the most useful testimony we have from inside the room, because she was physically present when Davis found out. Her description: it was a huge betrayal. Davis never got over it, never. And that you do not just get over something like that. She also says Davis kept loving her, and quotes her as saying, after all of it, "She's still my daughter." Cermak published her own book, Miss D and Me, in 2017, 32 years after My Mother's Keeper and 28 after Davis died. It is affectionate, and it presents Davis as eccentric and strong-willed and possessed of a heart of gold. And it is a deliberate attempt to repair a reputation that Cermak believes was destroyed unjustly. And when that book came out, B.D. Hyman, then 70, gave an interview to a British newspaper responding to it. In that interview, she said her mother genuinely believed she was a witch, that she cast spells on her enemies from her bed, and that she had once personally seen her mother transform into an evil, demonic presence. That is the lightning bolt, and the Salem ancestor, 60 years later, converted from a publicist's flourish into a literal claim by a woman who now runs a church, which is a genuinely strange thing to have happened to a piece of studio publicity. Bette Davis spent decades telling a joke about being descended from a witch, and her daughter spent decades in a religious tradition that does not treat that as a joke, and the two things met. That is 2017, 32 years after the first book, 28 years after Davis's death. And by then, B.D. Hyman was the head of her own ministry and a pastor in Virginia. And I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and cheap to use that quote to close the case, and it does not close the case. A woman who has spent 3 decades inside a specific religious framework will describe her past in the vocabulary of that framework. And my mother was a demonic presence may be a theological description of a real experience of a frightening parent, rather than a claim about literal transformation. But it also demonstrates the thing that destroyed her from the beginning, which is escalation. She began in 1985 with a portrait of a difficult, drinking, domineering woman, which was probably substantially accurate and which a great many people would have believed. And every time it was challenged, she raised the charge, until she arrived at witchcraft, and by the time you are at witchcraft, you have lost every reader you had. There is one more element, and it is the religion, which most accounts either ignore or use as a punchline, and it deserves better than either. B.D. Hyman became a born-again Christian in the early 1980s, and the conversion is not incidental to the book. It is the organizing principle of it, and it is the entire subject of the sequel. Her stated goal was not to expose her mother. It was to bring her mother to Christ. In her own framing, the book was an act of evangelism conducted at the highest possible cost to herself, and the failure of it was a failure of her mother's soul rather than of her own judgment. Take that seriously for a moment, because if you believe it, the timing question changes completely. A person who genuinely believes their mother is going to hell does not wait politely for her to die. Waiting is the one thing they cannot do. Christina Crawford could wait because Christina Crawford wanted the truth on the record. B.D. Hyman could not wait because a dead woman cannot repent. That is either the most coherent explanation anybody has offered for why she published while her mother was alive, or it is a religious justification bolted onto a commercial decision after the fact. I do not know which. Nobody does, including possibly her. Here is what I think is actually true, stated as clearly as the evidence permits. Bette Davis was almost certainly a hard mother. She drank. That is not seriously disputed by anybody, including her friends. She was combative and domineering and used to being obeyed in a profession that had rewarded her for exactly those qualities for 50 years. And there is no plausible version of that woman in which being her child was easy. She married 4 times, and 3 of those marriages collapsed, and the household B.D. grew up in was genuinely unstable. She sent a disabled daughter away at 3. She consented to her 16-year-old marrying a man of 29. Any child of that woman would have a substantial and legitimate case, and B.D. Hyman had that case, and she threw it away. And she threw it away for a specific reason. She needed her mother to be a monster rather than a difficult woman, because a difficult woman does not justify a book, and a monster does. So she wrote the book that the market had already been taught to want by Mommy Dearest 7 years earlier, and in reaching for total villainy, she surrendered the partial truth she actually held. That is the tragedy of it. She was probably right about a great deal, and she made herself impossible to believe about any of it. There is a further layer, and it is the coldest one. Look at what the 1985 book actually produced. It was a bestseller. Narrow is the Way, published 2 years later in 1987, was not. It sold poorly and generated almost no interest, and the difference between the two is instructive. The first one was a famous woman being taken apart. The second one was a religious memoir by that woman's daughter. The market wanted one and not the other, and it made its preference extremely clear. Bette Davis was correct about this and said so in the letter, and it is the most quietly devastating line she ever wrote about her daughter. Her name made the book a success. Nobody was buying B.D. Hyman. 40 years on, that judgment has held. The first book is remembered, the second is not, and the only reason anybody knows the author's name is the woman she wrote it about. The last years are worth describing properly because the image of a frail old woman is not quite right either. After the strokes, she went back to work. She made films in 1986 and 1987 and 1989, The Whales of August with Lillian Gish, which is genuinely good, and in which she is visibly, unignorably ill and completely in command. She did talk shows. She was, by the accounts of people who dealt with her professionally in those years, exactly as impossible as she had ever been, which everybody found reassuring. She also, in that period, gave interviews in which the book came up, and her handling of it was consistent. A short remark, a change of subject, and an occasional flash of something that people who were present described as grief rather than anger. She did not campaign. She wrote the letter once in her own book and then let it stand. That restraint is not what her reputation would predict, and it is the strongest thing in her favor in the whole affair. A woman famous for going to war with Jack Warner, with Joan Crawford, with the Academy, and with virtually every director she ever worked for, was handed the fight of her life at 77 and largely declined it. She died on the 6th of October, 1989, in France, of breast cancer at 81. She had gone to the San Sebastian Film Festival to receive an award, become too ill to travel home, and died at the American Hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine. She was buried at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills next to her mother Ruthie and her sister Barbara. Her headstone reads, "She did it the hard way." She had chosen the line herself years before, and B.D. Hyman was not at the funeral and had not spoken to her mother in 4 years. Michael Merrill handled the arrangements. Catherine Cermak was there. Margot, by then in her late 30s and still in care, is not recorded as having attended, and there is no account anywhere of what she understood about any of it, then or ever. Of Bette Davis's 3 children, one wrote 2 books denouncing her, one never said a public word, and one was never in a position to speak at all. So where does the record end up? There are 2 books by the daughter, one bestseller, and one failure. There is one book by the mother, containing a letter that answers a charge of alcoholism with a correction about Gone with the Wind. There is a book by the assistant published in 2017. There is a will. There is a 60 Minutes tape from before any of it in which the daughter says her mother was a good parent. There is a brother who never spoke publicly and never spoke to his sister again. And there is a sister who spent her entire life in institutional care and left no account of anything. Everybody in this story got to speak except the 2 people who could not, Margot and, in the sense that matters, Bette Davis herself, who by 1985 had lost much of her speech to 4 strokes and had to answer the most serious accusation of her life in writing at 77, with one side of her body not working. That is worth holding on to, whatever you conclude about the truth of the book. The most famously formidable woman in American film, the one who sued Warner Brothers, who ran the Academy for a fortnight, who took the parts nobody else would touch, spent the last 4 years of her life defending herself against her own child, in print, while partially paralyzed. The daughter is still alive, still a pastor, still saying it. There was no reconciliation, no deathbed scene, no letter that arrived in time. B.D. Hyman published a book to force her mother into a conversation, and the conversation that resulted was 2 open letters in 2 different memoirs, published 2 years apart, addressed to each other, and read by strangers. They never spoke again after 1985. Both of them said what they had to say in books, to an audience, which is the only language either of them had left. And that is the actual answer to why the daughter turned. Not the drinking, not the tantrums, not the money, not the religion, or not only those. B.D. Hyman grew up in a house where the public record was the real one, where a mother settled her arguments in print and in front of cameras and understood no other venue, and where a private letter was worth less than a paragraph in Variety. So when she finally had something to say, she said it the only way she had ever seen it done. She wrote it, and she sold it, and she waited for the review.